the 13th of February, 1542, inside the walls of the Tower of London, the Queen Consort of England took her final steps as she approached the executioner's scaffold. She was the fifth wife of Henry VIII, and Catherine Howard is considered one of the most tragic figures in English history. An incredibly young teenage girl when she was married to the almost 50-year-old ruthless Tudor monarch. Henry VIII, during their short time married, would exhibit and display his temper and brutal streak, but Catherine was never fit enough to have been a Queen of England. She was far too young to administer any advice or power alongside her husband, and she paid for her naive behaviour, in which she was accused of adultery with one of the king's favourite courtiers. The execution and brutal slaying of Catherine Howard, the king's fifth wife, is one of the most horrific actions administered by Henry VIII, and inside the Tower of London, her death was performed with no mercy. But how did Henry VIII take the head off his teenage queen? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Catherine Howard married King Henry VIII on the 28th of July 1530 inside of Oatlands Palace. The annulment between the Tudor king and his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, had taken place 19 days before, and Catherine Howard was considered someone who was rather promiscuous, even at a young age, making the decision for the king to marry her even stranger. What made this even worse was the fact that Henry VIII was 49, and Catherine, it's believed, was potentially around 17, or maybe even younger, which is even more troubling. Catherine, while she had been staying inside of the household of Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, may have been subjected to grooming at the hands of men such as her music teacher and also the secretary of the Dowager Duchess. She was most certainly groomed and pressured into possibly a physical relationship with these, but when she arrived at court through her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, she quickly captured the eye of the king. Catherine and Henry flirted, and the king found the teenage girl quite attractive, and they did interact publicly. But Catherine also had eyes for one of the king's courtiers, a man named Thomas Culpeper. But the king was already in negotiations for Catherine's hand in marriage. Catherine Howard was young and carefree, and she was too young to get involved in government affairs. No plans were made for Catherine's coronation, but she did receive a gun salute aboard the royal barge. She dressed in the finest clothes, and she was given huge presents and gifts from the king. But the Queen escaped London in the August of 1540, due to the plague ravaging the city, and the royal couple then travelled throughout England on their honeymoon. But the king became even more depressed and temperamental, especially as he was suffering from a festering ulcerous leg which was causing him huge problems. Catherine Howard then at this point may have drifted back closer towards Thomas Culpeper, the king's favourite male courtier. It was claimed that Culpeper succeeded the king in the queen's affections, and she had considered marrying Culpeper before her nuptials with the king, but Culpeper and Catherine then began in the spring of 1541 to meet in secret. Their meetings were facilitated by and arranged by Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn, the brother of Anne Boleyn. It's not known why Jane did this, but there were later witnesses who claimed that she had been involved in physical relations with men while she was in the care of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. But there were other rumours about the Queen and Culpeper, and someone suspected that they were having an affair, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, took it upon himself to investigate, probably to gain more favour in the eyes of the king. He discovered evidence of Culpeper and the Queen's liaisons, and this included a love letter sent between the pair. This was written in the Queen's handwriting, and on the 1st of November 1541, whilst the king was praying inside of the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace, he was informed by Cranmer about his wife's infidelities. Catherine Howard heard about this, and she ran down the long gallery outside the chapel, screaming, before she was then locked away in her quarters, held under arrest. It was claimed during her questioning that I found her in such lamentation and heaviness, as I never saw no greater, that it would have pitied any man's heart to then look upon her. Further evidence was discovered about a possible pre-contract of marriage she may have had with Francis Derham, and this would have invalidated the king and Catherine's marriage, and this was very serious. Catherine denied this and claimed that she was assaulted, but on the 23rd of November 1541 she was stripped of the title of queen and was locked up inside of Sion Abbey. She would then never see her husband again. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham, the two men implicated in Catherine Howard's scandal, were then sentenced to death for high treason. Derham was hanged, drawn and quartered, but Culpeper was executed by beheading, and their heads were both placed upon spikes above London Bridge. It was claimed that while she travelled down the river to the Tower of London for her imprisonment, that she passed under the heads of her former lovers, and she screamed when she cast her eyes upon them. A number of Catherine Howard's relatives were locked up inside the Tower of London, and Catherine had an act of attainder passed against her, and this allowed Henry VIII to execute his fifth wife without any questions asked or the need for a trial. This secured her fate, and when she arrived at the Tower of London, she passed through Traitor's Gate, and she was then taken into her prison cell. Her execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on the 13th of February 1542, her crime being treason and sleeping with someone behind the king's back, and also for failing to disclose her former sexual history to the king. Catherine Howard's execution was ruthless and harrowing. It's believed that she may have been 19 years of age, or even younger, when she was imprisoned in the Tower of London. It was the act of attainder that allowed Henry to do what he pleased and execute Catherine. No one could question it. It was the law. The king passed to allow him to slaughter his teenage wife, and by not allowing her a trial, it made sure that the king would not be further embarrassed by the accusations that he had been cuckolded. Previously, Henry VIII had also executed his second wife, Anne Boleyn, who lost her head in the Tower of London. But the king summoned a French swordsman to take her head off, this being seen as an act of mercy, as the sword was much more reliable than the axe, which was then used to take heads off. Anne Boleyn's procession to the scaffold was rather luxurious, and an expensive black cloth and velvet decorated the Tower of London and the scaffold, and she was also allowed to make a speech to the small gathering of witnesses. Catherine Howard was given absolutely nothing. There was no fancy cloth signalling the death of a queen, just hay that had been thrown on the scaffold platform to soak up the young queen's blood. There was also no swordsman, but the local London axeman was invited inside the tower to take her head clean off, and the axe, as mentioned, was less reliable and it was more prone to mistakes. Catherine Howard, at the scheduled time of her execution, was led out of her room, and she was then made her way to the scaffold, which was found next to the White Tower. She was helped up the scaffold by guards, and whilst on the scaffold, she made a short speech declaring that her punishment was worthy and just, and she asked for mercy from the crowd for her family, and asked for them to pray for her soul. Catherine Howard, the Queen Consort of Henry VIII and fifth wife of the notorious Tudor king, then placed her head on the block and said her final prayers before the executioner crashed his sharp axe down upon her neck and took her head off in one sharp blow of his weapon. This showed the skill of the executioner and that he was an experienced man with the axe. Following her death, her remains were collected and the blood ran off the scaffold, and her remains were then wrapped in a white cloth before they were taken into the Tower of London's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and buried in a rough grave. But Henry VIII had one more instruction for the Tower of London's officials. He ordered the body of Catherine Howard to be covered in quicklime, dissolving her remains, and they have never been found. The way that Henry VIII was able to take the head of his fifth wife was through the Act of Attainder, and the law that said he could legally do this without any trial. This denied Catherine a chance to get her side of the story across, and it compounded her guilt. At the time, whatever the king said went, even if he had to face accusations of the fact he had been cuckolded. It was a highly embarrassing scandal for Henry VIII, and one he would end ruthlessly by having the commoner's axe crash down upon the neck of his teenage wife, and he would also ensure her remains were wiped off the face of the earth, never to be found again. Catherine Howard is remembered now as one of the most tragic figures of the Tudor period. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.